Our friend Dolphus Ramser was born and raised in Concord, North Carolina, a town so rich with history that it provided the inspiration for his independent record label and management company. So great was the city's influence on Ramser that he continues to live and work in Concord today, with a full-time staff located in both North Carolina and California. He and his team always put their clients' music first, work as hard as they can, and have fun along the way. Visit Ramser.com to learn more.
Welcome to The Road to Now, where we look to the past
and everywhere in between
to understand the present. I'm Bob Crawford, and joining me as always is Dr. Ben Sawyer.
It's great to be here with you guys, and it's great to be continuing this series on energy.
Today, the topic is renewable energy. Ben, who is our guest?
Our guest is Alexis Madrigal, a journalist. He's worked for The Atlantic. He's worked for Wired. He wrote an amazing book, Powering the Dream, The History and Promise of Green Technology. Couldn't have found a better guest, I think, both in terms of knowledge and in terms of just rolling with the conversation. Like, we always try on this podcast to make a conversation less of an interview. And Alexis was on fire the whole time. And this is really the total package in terms of this interview.
I think what's interesting and what we learned in this episode was that we all kind of think that renewables are this the silver bullet to America's energy problems, really the planet's energy problems. But they come with their own baggage as well. And there are unintended consequences that come along with renewable energy.
That's right. And any type of energy that we have, one of the important variables, can you use it everywhere? And sustainable technology right now, we think about it being the solution to all the problems, but there's no one solution. We have to work comprehensively and we have to think about the costs and benefits. Not everything is going to be perfect. And there are always externalities. There are always people outside of the production of energy and consumption of energy who are going to be affected by that.
Yeah, Ben, we've seen, looking at American history since the founding, that new technologies bring great upheaval with them. A lot of people lose their jobs. People really get left behind. But all of the stereotypes about renewable energy, they're all true. You know, it is true that lobbyists from oil and coal and other forms try to keep them down. That's true. It is true that there's not enough investment. That's also true. But there's also the factor, like you talked about which of these renewable forms, be it wind or solar, play best in what regions. They've come a long way. We're so glad that we have Alexis to guide us through.
Agreed. And before we go on to the episode, I just want to remind everyone to please go rate us on iTunes. Check out our website. The ratings on iTunes, you guys wouldn't even believe how helpful they are. If you go in there and rate us, if you just take a second, it oftentimes moves us into different categories, moves us up in the list. When I'm looking for new podcasts, I'll go through certain lists and try to find things. As much as I want to be thorough, sometimes I don't want to scroll through 50 or 100. So if you do that, it moves us up. It helps people get the word out there. If you like this podcast and you think other people would enjoy it, we'd really appreciate that. And I also want to add, each of our episodes that we do here has its own episodes page on our website, theroadtonow.com. So if you go there, you'll see that not only do we have these episodes, we also have links to relevant materials. And the one we did last week, episode number 62 with Jim Clark and Steve Cron on nuclear energy, they put together an amazing list of resources that you can get there. And they're all linked right there on our website, theroadtonow.com. Alexis Madrigal, welcome to The Road to Now.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You wrote this great book, came out in 2011, called Powering the Dream, The History and Promise of Green Technology. I want to start off with the first line of the book. You could be excused for thinking that there's no history of what we call green technology. And then you go on to say that for most people who have some idea of this, they imagine hippies in the 1960s, the images of Reagan taking the solar panels off the White House after Carter left. And you actually began to research this, and you discovered that there is an entire history of green energy that dates back over 100 years. Could you talk about that and how you came about this topic?
Yeah, totally. I think like most people, I just kind of grew up thinking of like solar as kind of a joke, as like wind power is kind of a joke. It's part of like the general hippie punching that people did at that time. And As I was working for Wired magazine, and I got into covering energy, and it's kind of the mid-aughts, and you sort of have a lot of knowledge of climate change and just sort of general green technology kind of coming to the fore, coming back around. And I started like digging in and realized that, as far back as you can go in the kind of industrial history of America, you find renewable energy. Like the story that most people learn about the industrialization of the world is that it's basically these British guys burning coal to make steam, and that's industrialization. But like American industrialization happened like a little bit later in time. Like we're going on in the 1830s and 1840s, and in fact, like concede that some of the downsides from burning large amounts of coal to make steam, and in fact, like tried to make a better kind of industrialization that was in fact dependent on water power in the Northeast, not on coal. I mean, there was some coal in Pittsburgh and in Pennsylvania, but the sort of the spark, the sort of industrial capitalism in the United States is actually renewable power.
Yeah, it's amazing that they set up the water mills, right? It's water wheels that are set up, and you have to be in a certain place. So you have to be in New England is the place where the water drops enough near the coast to power those mills. And you already have that divide between the North and the South, and that just digs it in even further.
Totally. And I think, one of the things you see are these incredible and interesting kind of regional variations when it comes to renewable energy. And that's actually part of what makes it interesting. It's embedded in a place, right? Like windy places are good for wind power, sunny places good for solar power. And there's stories from all over the country that I found while researching the book that are all kind of different. I mean, it's with oil or with coal or natural gas, you put that thing into a plant. The plants are kind of the same everywhere, nuclear power, and it kind of all works the same. And so one of the things that I gloried in this book was like finding these like local stories of renewable energy production, because they really are specific to that place. And probably my favorite is in Nebraska in the 1890s. There was a guy named Irwin Barber, who was this sort of Nebraska state geologist. And because he was basically a dinosaur hunter, dinosaur bone hunter, would like go all over the country, with his team looking for stuff. And one thing that he kept noticing was that there were all of these strange windmills around. So, you kind of think of the classic it's kind of in a circle, and it's got all those kind of vanes. And then it's kind of got this like back piece and like a tail. Right. So that's kind of like the classic. That's the air motor. It's incredibly popular. There were millions of them in the United States that were used to pump water. But in these places that were poor farmers, they just made their own. And Barber gave them names like jumbos, merry-go-rounds, battle axes, mock turbines, the Dutch. And do you want me to read you? He has this great piece about sort of how they built these things.
Oh, yeah, please.
Read a little bit. Okay.
Read it.
So it says, old wire, bolts, nails, screws, and other odds and ends of hardware, old lumber, poles, and braces, such as are common to every farm, enter largely into construction. Even neglected mowers, reapers, and planters, old buggies and wagons contribute material. The farmer who is inventive enough to build a mill is competent to see quickly the adaptability of certain parts to his ideas. And that's what they did. They made these things. He recorded it in this kind of weird U.S. Geological Survey pamphlet. And now we know that story. And I think there's probably untold other stories of that kind of like micro innovation, people just like using what's to hand to sort of capture pieces of the natural power in the world.
So if that kind of innovation and ingenuity was being put into action in the late 19th century, why isn't wind power a major source of our nation's energy? Just a couple days ago, Donald Trump was saying that Vladimir Putin would be much happier if Hillary Clinton was president. Basically, he was saying that if Hillary was president, the country would be dotted with windmills everywhere. Besides Hillary losing, why isn't the country dotted with windmills if they were doing it over 130 years ago?
Well, I mean, I don't know how often you've flown across the country, but it kind of is Texas and Iowa and some of these places. Renewable energy on some days is like 20, 30, 40% of the power in those states. So it has happened. There's a lot of reasons for it, though. I mean, the main things are that fossil fuels work really well. I mean, I think that one thing that a lot of renewable energy people forget is just like fossil fuels are incredibly convenient. You can like pump them out of the ground or dig them out of the ground. You can put them on railroad car and ship around the country. You can pump them in a pipeline. You can put them on a boat. And like the great achievement of the fossil fuel industry is just being able to handle so much material. And what they have done because of that scale is be able to drive the price down of energy for everybody. I mean, one of the things that, the first great energy story of the 20th century is just like the price of energy coming down so much. And with it, the price of mobility, the price of light, the price of heat, all of those things were just plummeting for the 20th century, all the way basically up until almost 1970. And the reason is you built these bigger and bigger plants. You have bigger and bigger oil production fields, and that things get really, really cheap. And when we think about all the things that are problems with the energy industry, I think it's really easy to forget that for the first 60, 70 years of the 20th century, these are heroes. These are people who are like absolute, like rural electrification projects, like the Southeast. California was just like the one of the key limiting factors out here was just like power. We didn't have coal, and then we figure out, all right, we can tap natural gas fields out here, right? And now suddenly, like California's got like all the power at once, all the heat at once, all the light at once. And now that we have those things, I think we take for granted the achievements of the past, even though obviously it's created like all of these problems. I mean, like I really believe global warming is like a very like a civilizational level problem that we have to deal with. Yeah, but one of the things that gives me hope is like, look at what we did already. Look what we did in the 20th century. That was amazing. We went from a place where basically no one had power. Access to mobility was incredibly limited. It was hard to move around the country. By the end of the century, everybody can go wherever they want all the time at really low prices. Electricity costs like 10 cents a kilowatt hour, on average across the country. It's available to basically everyone. If we could do that, it feels like, all right, getting to like a zero carbon future also seems possible.
So if we had electric cabs in Manhattan in the 1890s, we had geothermal heating in the early 20th century, how do we make it affordable and less expensive and therefore practical for today's world?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're starting to see hints of how this is going to go. I mean, in a lot of cases, a lot of the energy industry, it has started out with subsidies of one kind or another. And there's kind of like been two main kinds. Basically, what economists call externalities, right? You cause a problem that you don't have to price into your product. So in a lot of the fossil fuel industry, we basically, and also in nuclear power in some ways, we just said, well, you don't actually have to take into account these other costs of doing business. And I see that as a kind of subsidy to the energy industry. I mean, if it was your neighbor and they were they were like polluting your land, like you would in fact believe that. And in fact, one of the most fascinating and underrated stories in the book, which actually I haven't thought of for a long time, is there was this incredible battle in Chicago over what was called the Smoke Nuisance. And the Smoke Nuisance was basically that before you had sort of centralized power stations that were sending light, heat, and power around the cities, you had people burning their own coal in boilers. And their boiler, let's say you had a dress factory and next door there was like a guy like burning the dirtiest, cheapest coal possible in a dirty boiler. It was just like covering your stuff with soot. And they drew on this kind of series of laws that were called Nuisance Laws that were actually for like if you were next to like a butcher or you were next to like a slaughterhouse, and it was like, it meant like, hey, you can't throw entrails on your neighbor's lawn. They basically
good law.
used,
good law.
this thing. And like a lot of those reformers who worked on just like general progressivism, one of their, and also teetotaling, they're totally wrong about that one, but that worked on sort of like reforming cities. One of the big things was also the smoke nuisance. And I've always thought like that's like a story that needs to come back, because it was like all these like really powerful progressive women who like united to try and like clean up the air in their cities. So that's kind of one piece of it. And the other piece of it is just like straight up like subsidy from the government, either for research and development, or for deployment. In the case of like, say, nuclear power, for example, there's like been tremendous government support for that all through time, at least, 1945 onward. And there were geopolitical reasons for that. There just sort of this idea of progress that nuclear power was, and all that stuff. And I think what you're going to see in a lot of things like electric cars, and you've already started to see it in solar, that you can use like targeted government assistance to prod the private industry to drive the cost down. And the way that a lot of people think about this is they call it learning by doing. And I think basically the more chances you have to do something and scale something up, the better you get at doing it, which drives the cost down. And I think the key question for everybody around things like solar and electric cars is like, how much does the price come down per, say, like doubling of production? And I think one of the things that seems to be happening in solar is they've done a lot of learning by doing. And so you are starting to see like tremendous ramp up in solar installations. And it's just the way that you would expect it to go in any other industry. I think that, there's nothing mystical about it. It's like how technological development has tended to work.
Yeah, I just like the idea of like the Chicago butcher like throwing the entrails on the neighbor's lawn, and then somebody being like, "Hey, you can't do that," and him being like, "But if I have to pay to have it hauled off, it's going to bring the price of pork up," and then everybody's like, "Okay, then I guess you just get to do that from now on."
Exactly, but that's
kind
actually
of the same thing.
Right? No, I mean that is it. That is in fact like the problem in the energy industry, right? I mean, it's like you think about coal plants burning coal that like throws out like mercury and lead and all these other things. I mean, it is, to me, it is functionally the same thing. And I think even coal plant operators have more or less accepted that they have a responsibility to handle that in some way or another. Of course, they're going to fight it every step of the way, but the basics of the dynamic are established now,
Yeah, but with coal, it's kind of like they're like, I mean, if we have to take care of this pollution, the cost will go up. Also, do you hate America? Because if so, regulate us.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's the politics of these things are so strange, and they've been strange through history, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, it's crazy to me that the conservatives have essentially tended to adopt like centralized energy technologies, things that require huge plants, nuclear plants, coal plants, these things, when the way that they have tended to think about power in a more general sense is in this kind of Jeffersonian kind of conversation where it's more like, let's like push power to the edges. Let's like distribute power to locals, right? And that kind of community scale energy stuff is like totally the realm of renewable energy. And yet like people have never really been able to get on board with that. There's actually I don't know. Do you want me to tell you an interesting story about this, about Reagan?
Please do.
It's interesting because in the 70s, right, you have this energy crisis.
This is NBC Nightly News, Wednesday, October 17th. Reported by John Chancellor.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
And eventually a place is created called the Solar Energy Research Institute, which now is called the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and in fact has been like targeted by the Trump administration for cuts. But back in the 70s, it's this new thing. And the guy who created Earth Day, or co-created Earth Day, named Dennis Hayes, is running it right as like sort of Reagan is sort of running for president against Carter. And it's actually fascinating because like a hardcore libertarian for Vermont like wrote some of Reagan's radio speeches during that time. and actually included support for solar and renewable in those speeches precisely as a kind of libertarian form of energy. And so the people at the Solar Energy Research Institute, when Reagan came into office, were sort of convinced that maybe they would be spared, that in fact, like, they would be adopted as part of this kind of libertarian energy platform. But instead, what happened was Reagan put a dentist in charge of the Department of Energy, who then like wiped them out, more or less. Probably like the second worst Department of Energy pick, other than the current one. So it's interesting to see.
I'm just wondering if the use of fossil fuels came into vogue or just became more practical in the early 20th century. Did these green technologies kind of just go underground? Did they go completely away? What happened to them? Because I guess the 70s is kind of when they kind of made their comeback, right?
Yeah. Well, they didn't go away. There were always people who would get interested, and who would think like, man, what could we do with this? And, in particular in the kind of mid-century, maybe you'd expect this, actually, but it kind of follows the path that a lot of research and development takes after World War II, right? So World War II kind of concentrates a bunch of people inside the government who kind of get one particular way of thinking about sort of large-scale government R&D. I mean, it makes sense because you've also got like AT&T and these other large corporations that are sort of coming along, and they have these very structured kind of research environments to sort of do stuff. And so you have people kind of trying to kind of shoehorn solar into that kind of very establishment kind of framework. These people are mostly kind of research scientists, some of whom worked on nuclear power too. They were very like kind of conservative people who just sort of saw the features of solar power as being interesting. A lot of them were more interested actually in solar heating technologies. So they, in a lot of cases, looked at things like solar thermal fields, which actually do exist now, both in Israel, in the US, and a few other places.
It's the giant one out there in California, right?
Yeah, exactly. You use mirrors to heat either oil that gets very hot, and then you use that to create steam, or you direct them directly onto you direct the mirrors to point directly at a what's called a power tower. And then you're able to generate steam like that. And they put up, there were people like a husband and wife couple called the Minels, who sort of suggested that if you just put up like, a 200 square mile solar facility like that in the Southwest, you could like power all of the United States and things like that. There were people who were kind of keeping these things alive. But by and large, these things went super underground. In a few cases, they like popped out to other countries. So there was some Israeli technology, solar technological development. There was the Dutch kept going with wind technology, which turned out to be a very good thing. But the main place that solar really goes, two main places, are into the oil industry and into space. So what's interesting, right, is like if you think about the International Space Station, right, it's got all these solar panels on it. The reason is like you can't like run a fossil fuel plant up there. It's not really how it works. And so people were looking at kind of two competing technologies, right? There were either these radioisotope thermal generators, right, where you essentially have like a small radioactive thing that you use to generate power, or you use solar panels. And so NASA ends up funding, NASA funded vast amounts of non-space research while funding space research in the 60s, but NASA ends up funding some of this development. And then there are other places where power is really expensive, particularly electrical power, out on oil rigs. And so the oil industry actually takes up the development and continues bringing down the price of solar electricity, solar photovoltaics. And then eventually that catches up in the 1980s and you get it comes back into sort of normal kind of like R&D, but kind of the hibernation places, which is how I take this question, were like many and like varied and weird. It's like space, the Netherlands, oil rigs. I think the maybe one other point to make on it, like a short point, is just that there are some researchers, like a guy named Gregory Nemeth, who thinks that basically the government should invest like counter-cyclically in energy technology. So basically people get interested in energy technology when the price of oil and other fossil fuels is high. and then they sort of abandon it when the price gets low. And that boom bust cycle tends to like sort of force people out of the industry. So his feeling is we should be investing in the opposite cycle of when like the sort of private markets are willing to put money behind renewable energy technologies, because that's what the Dutch government did. And it in fact was able to keep people inside the wind industry with knowledge who've done that learning by doing, and who then can pass that knowledge on to other people.
Right, because it's really hard to imagine yourself investing in the specialization that you have to have if you also realize that, oil prices drop another $1 and you're out of work.
Exactly. And that's happened so many times. And, you have all these people, back when I was researching this book in the aughts, right? All these people were coming back into the wind industry after having left being in the 80s. And, a lot of them went to like aeronautics, right? They went to work for Boeing because, you're kind of fundamentally working with the forces of kind of metal in a particular shape and air. It's like you go find some other work and then you've lost really valuable people. And the same is true for all of these renewable energy technologies. And that's a net loss for society as far as I'm concerned. You have to redo a lot of the learning again. And even if you preserve all of the papers and stuff, which that, by the way, didn't happen. But even if you had done that, you'd lose the valuable knowledge and intuition that people have.
We have this world. We started out talking about the notion of green technology is, the 60s and on. But you say in your book, and by the way, I love this line, is the idea that we don't imagine that there were ever other technologies before that. You have this quote, victors don't only write the history in military battles. In other words, these guys won, and, we've forgotten about that before. But you also say here, you make the point that technology is a function of decisions. We have to understand why the decision was made. And that also there were, alongside the many, many failures and inefficient green technologies, you pointed that there were moments where there was a feasible path towards green energy. Could you tell us about that?
I think there's only a few circumstances where you can say, okay, if we would have gone a different way, the world now would be totally different. One of the really interesting ones is there was, in the early days of cars, you have different powers for the cars. There are steam-powered cars, which is kind of wild to think about. There were gasoline-powered cars, and there were electric vehicles. There were battery-powered cars. And there was a big kind of, it's hilarious, but it was basically the bicycle people came together with some investors and said, we're going to create this car concern that runs electric taxis in Manhattan. And they built like this whole battery swapping technology and everything to be able to do this. And it was a real going concern for a while. And I think like what's interesting is that the model that kind of pointed to, because it required this sort of battery swapping infrastructure and all of that kind of stuff, was kind of transportation as a service. And now here we are, we have Uber, we have Lyft. We are increasingly seeing the recovery of that kind of transportation as a service as a model for people getting around cities. And I just think that it's moments like that. It's less like going to be a direct swap out of technology. And it's usually more where, well, what if we had actually developed a different idea for how this particular kind of technology or this particular kind of human need would be satisfied by this set of, companies and technologies. And obviously, out in the rural hinterlands, are you going to have mobility as a service? Like, no, you're not. You're going to have something else. But it's not that hard to imagine, particularly at that moment in time in the 1890s, where bicycles have swept the nation. They're this incredible craze. So it's not crazy to think that you would have had a development model that would have been much tighter in cities, which would have been electric vehicles as a service. In some ways, that's what Europe's going to look like in like 20 years.
All the promises automakers have made about the future of cars. It's a recent article from July 7th in The Atlantic. You kind of talk about this swapping out of technology, and you kind of go through each major automaker and kind of tell us where they hope to get to and when they hope to be there. And it seems like by 2025, every major auto company is going to have a self-driving vehicle or a fully electric vehicle, almost all of them.
That's where you see it going. I have a 4-year-old son, and I don't expect him to ever get a license. At 12 years from now, when he could start getting his license here in California, there's going to be self-driving cars on the road. There's 100% chance of that, I think now. It's just like we're going to need to rethink the way that cars work, the way that all of that stuff works. And because of that, the way that cities work, because cities are so much of any city, the surface area of it and the flows through it are dominated by the way that we've thought about cars driven by human beings who can be tired, distracted, drunk, etc.
You talk about your son never driving. I have a special needs daughter who probably never will be able to drive. But with this technology, she may have that independence and freedom by having a self-driving car.
Hopefully it generates more equity in exactly that way.
I'll tell you, Alexis, one more thing. My fear with this technological change, the massive loss of jobs.
Yeah.
With truckers and people who make their living driving. Is there any way around that?
God. There's a lot of talk here in the Bay about this. I think that there is going to be brutal job loss. I don't think that there's at this point, I'm pretty convinced that's just coming. I think that one of the major questions is how organized is labor or our people or our workers, however you want to think about it, how organized are they going to be across industries? Because, unions have long worked within industries. A lot of those unions have been broken. A lot of them are really weak for one reason or another. And I feel like non-controllers of computer capital are going to need to kind of organize for their rights in different kinds of ways. And I'm really, there's a woman out here named Carmen Rojas working on something called the Workers Lab, where they're working on all these other ways of trying to generate more power for working people that outside of the traditional union tools of, kind of the closed shop and the contract. There are these great pools of workers now, either on the low end, W-2 side, working retail or working in fast food or whatever, who can't control their schedules, have no say over how the workplace is run, who are in incredibly precarious positions. Then there's all the 1099 workers, the people who are out there working for Uber and Lyft and other kinds of places where they're not technically an employee, but they also that's their job. And there's so much that those people could come together on to try and reform the system as these technologies kind of come down the line and put more pressure on the job market. I think that it just comes down to how organized are people going to be around these things? How divided are we going to remain as the normal people instead of the people who own everything? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that the answer in the 1980s with office workers, because we actually recently went through a massive automation episode. Most of the work in 1970 that we thought of as office work, right, is gone now. And it didn't necessarily get replaced. How much resistance and pushback was there on that? Almost none. The offices had not been a very organized place in union terms or in any kind of labor terms. And I think people got wiped out, and that's just what happened.
Would you call for, it sounds almost like you need to go back to that old model, the IWW, the industrial union, as opposed to the craft union.
I just think some of those things need to be re-excavated, right? They need to be brought back. This is a new world that we're entering. And I think that one hopeful thought that I have is that the way that automation wipes out jobs, this new round of kind of artificial intelligence automation wipes out jobs, is going to be less kind of moving up the class pyramid, and it's going to wipe out people kind of pockmarking the different industries and salary ranks and job levels. And so I actually think that creates an opportunity to create a kind of new sort of network within there. I feel like the traditional thinking about what your class interest is sort of very limiting in something like this, where it's sort of that is a different configuration, it's a different constellation that people haven't really thought about, because it's going to wipe out managers. And so how do you bring these people together to sort of argue for the rights of humans versus corporate persons using artificial intelligences?
I think that's what we saw in the last election, right? Was the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and the people who supported Trump.
Trade relations with China have been a disaster for the American worker.
China is the greatest theft. It's the greatest theft in the history of mankind, what they've done to this country.
It's a bizarre happening. I mean, the working class people, blue collar people have known that the world was getting worse off for them since the 1970s. But in the last 10, 15 years, college educated, middle class people are feeling it too. And there's a weird alliance there.
Yeah, for sure.
We always we think Ben and I have done a series about energy, and we've looked at coal. There are evils that are on the surface that you can see, like, this is what's bad about coal. It's easy. But as far as renewable, there are those downsides that we kind of I think we think about renewable energy, solar panels and batteries, windmills as being this silver bullet, this perfect fix. But really, when you're talking about human capital, there is no perfect fix, because having a bunch of people on a planet is a complex operation.
Well, and you look at, batteries, say, they require these metals, which largely come from copper mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you trace back some of these things that are, they're obviously in all the phones we're talking on right now too, but they get sent to smelters in China, and those guys turn it into batteries. It's a crazy percentage of the Congo's minerals end up in smelters in China and then in batteries for cars and phones. Right now it's largely phones, but eventually it'll be cars and it'll be solar energy backup and all that stuff. And so what you have is a supply chain that on the human side of it, right, is dependent on, in a lot of cases, child labor, really nasty working conditions that are, exploitative. I've always thought this about energy, though. The second you start to get into it for real, it's all these things have trade-offs. They just all do. And I think, for me, the most pressing ones are climate change, and then the local health of communities around around mines and drilling operations, right? And for that reason, even though I wrote a book on renewable energy, I'm not opposed to nuclear energy in any hard sense. You want it sort of done right. It'd be nice if there were these sort of next generation reactors that were safer. You want to make sure that it makes sense and that the mining operations are safe, and there's all these things, right? It's done right. But in principle, I'm not opposed to it. And in fact, I wish more work had been done over the last 40 years. The problem is that the main supporters of nuclear power on the right are also opposed to the government sort of getting involved any more than it already has. And you kind of need it for nuclear power because the private markets see nuclear power as too risky to invest in. Because if you did have the backing of Republicans who believed in the power of their own government to do good, then you probably actually would have more nuclear power in this country, So anyway, left to its own devices right now, the power market's going to build a lot of solar, and it's going to build tons of natural gas plants. And that's what's going to happen.
Alexis, you were born in Mexico City, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
You grew up in Washington State.
Yep.
That's a lot of moving. You then went to school at Harvard. You now live in the Bay Area. But when you were a kid in Mexico City and Washington State, were you one day I'm going to write a history of green energy? And if not, what drove you to do that?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple answers to this. I think if I would have known myself slightly better, I would have known that I had sort of a historian's cast of mind, though I'm not a professional historian. I love the texture of old words and pictures. I love primary sources, and I just have since I was a little kid. I think that what happened really, though, if you must know the truth, is that when I made the move into journalism was right as the sort of bubble was bursting and family went bankrupt, everybody was broke, And I had just made the move and like run up credit card debt on the premise that, well, if I get into trouble, like my family can help me out. And just, we had nothing. We just had just nothing. And, we're like sending each other like $500 around to like make, pay the bills, And so like, this is terrible financial advice, but I thought to myself, well, I'll just like pitch this book on green technology because it sounds fun. And I'll use the advance to pay off my credit card bills. And in fact, that is what happened. But it meant
that's a master stroke.
Yeah. But it meant that I couldn't quit my day job. So I basically worked during the day at Wired, and then I would just like go home, have dinner with my then girlfriend, now wife, and then I would just work until I fell asleep on my computer, So that's kind of what happened. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I was fascinated by the topic, and I was a young journalist and felt like this would let me fill in all my gaps. I get to go study the history of technology in this really intense and important way. And I feel like it did do that. I feel like it gave me this grounding both in kind of the, history and current practice of, what's called in the academy, science and technology studies. And that has turned out to be incredibly important for me, like in just sort of looking at any issue from driverless cars to whatever, and that's how it happened though. I mean, I can guarantee you there's a 100% chance that I would not have written a book at that time in my life, were it not for a crushing debt burden that I found myself under.
And you wrote an excellent book. I'll just say, if you're having one of those hard times in your life, just remember, credit card debt drove this book. If you like this podcast, I got a PhD because I did not get hired as a high school history teacher in my hometown. So keep dreaming and keep moving forward.
Absolutely. That's right. It's a good lesson for the kids out there. Yeah.
Well, Alexis, it has been a pleasure, and I really enjoy your articles.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Our program is produced by Bob Crawford, Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta, edited by Bob Crawford and Ian Scotta. Paul DeFiglia provides our music. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and rate us on iTunes. For more information about this or any other episode, please visit theroadtonow.com. For Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.